need to introduce. It's kind of ridiculous, right? So I've been following Eric since the days of Hodinkee, Bring a Loop. That was my favorite. It was like Fridays, right?
Yeah.
So every Friday I would read Bring a Loop so I could go on eBay and figure out what to hate on the next day. Because Eric did a really great job of pointing out like some really cool things and then some completely bogus things. And I always found that, in fact, to me, that was like the good old days of Hodinkee. And I know Eric has a really close affinity for the Hodinkee family, but that was to me like the epitome of Hodinkee. That was the high point in my own mind and in my own heart. But Eric's got this crazy background. And by the way, I'm going to so blow you up, so you're going to have to correct so much of what I say. Eric graduated undergrad from Georgetown University and then went to Oxford, right? Oxford, okay, because Cambridge is the other guy.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Went to Oxford. Now, he's a little bit of an overachiever, just tiny bit, right? So then to Oxford, and was really kind of interested in a career, if I remember correctly, in the Foreign Service and all that stuff. And I think actually he's probably a CIA operative working within the watch industry. I mean, that's a fact, by the way. That's not just my speculation. Eric ultimately, after a few different career choices and moves and opportunities, wound up part-time writing for Hodinkee, Bring a Loop, and then wound up, more significantly to you all here in the room, essentially running the fine watch department for Christie's for a couple of years, and really honing his skills, applying his skills to the watch community at such a high, incredibly high level, and today operates Wind Vintage, his own vintage watch firm. Eric and I only met through, and I've got to give a thanks to our good friends Clint and Kelly, who are friends of Eric's and have spent time with him personally, and they suggested that we reach out. And so Eric and I got to work a little bit together. I was helping a client sell a Paul Newman Daytona. And I have to say, Eric wasn't the high bidder on the watch. And I actually, and all the guys that were involved were personal friends of mine, and Eric became a friend through the process. But actually, I gained more respect and appreciation for him in that process after I already respected and appreciated him, because he knew the market. He knew what he was willing to do in this particular situation. He stuck to that. He had discipline. Those are all things I admire. And so tonight, I would introduce to you Eric Wind. I love the fact that if you pronounce it differently, it's Wind. I'm sure that's never been said before.
How to spell?
W-I-N-D. And so off of his most recent lecture at the New York Horological Society and his involvement in the global watch community, I would just introduce to you Eric Wind. Please. Yeah.
That's a good intro.
That was very nice.
That was freaking phenomenal.
I'm just going to sit down. I don't have anything to add. But I think that for those of you that are sort of interested in a broader approach to collecting, I gave a talk in March at the New York Horological Society. It's about an hour and 20 minutes, so I won't replicate that talk tonight because I think we all want our steak or chicken or other entrees. But, I'll talk just to sort of a few of the main mistakes. I know there's sort of a whole array from vintage experts to those that are sort of interested in vintage watches that are more modern focused here tonight. Just with a few tips that I would have on a high end for someone interested in vintage watch collecting, and then the macro trends I'm seeing in the market. One of the biggest mistakes I see people making when they're coming in looking for a vintage watch is they're going for a reference rather than quality example. So they say, I want this Rolex Submariner 5513, no date sub, but it's hard to understand the difference between a really good one that's in all original condition, versus one that has maybe a lot of service parts, service bezel insert, replacement crown, maybe even replacement dial, replacement hands, very common with those. This emphasis on quality is of course seen in many other collector markets where there are things that are not unique, because all these watches, almost all of these were made in thousands of units, many thousands of units. So if you think about coin collecting, I'm not a coin expert by any means, but talking to clients that are into that, if you have a Mercury dime, say from the 1920s, that's an average example, say it's a $5 coin. But if you get to that grade 65, it's $2,000. So we're seeing that sort of difference in the multiple between an average condition and a spectacular example is increasing. I think a very good example that just happened last month in Geneva is there was a Rolex Submariner reference 5508, which is a small crown Submariner, no crown guards. That one's from 1958. That watch in sort of mediocre condition is maybe 60 to 80,000 with the original red triangle insert, which represents about $40,000 of that value.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That little freaking red triangle.
So, I actually was doing
I'm gonna get a tattoo of a red triangle. right after we're done here.
It actually, these bezel inserts, which can run upwards of $50,000 now, if you measure it on a per ounce basis, is one of the most valuable materials on Earth, more valuable than any rare earth element, etc. So that's that difference between average and spectacular is increasing. So that the one in Geneva, that an average example would be 60 to 80,000, sold for 500,000, and had been worn only a few days in its life, and was found in a storage locker. The person apparently bought the storage unit for under $100 because everything was marked as trash inside. He's bought it, I think it was $40 was the exact price he paid. Starts opening up trash bags, finds a Submariner in the box, and then finds a bag of Spanish gold coins as well.
Oh my God. Well done.
Doubloons. So the estate that didn't bother to go through that was very upset. The estate managers. That's sort of part of the fun of all this, is the treasure hunting aspect as well. I mean, there are people, I know a number of people that after the sale of the Paul Newman Daytona in October 2017 saw on the news this watch, looked down at their wrist and said, "Hey, I have that watch." And they thought it was worth $5,000. They bought it new in the early 1970s, etc., and then realized they had something worth over 200,000 in some cases. So that's one of the macro trends, the difference in quality. The other macro trend is the market is expanding in a massive way. I think people really don't realize how many more participants are in the vintage collector community than even 3 years ago. And to put it into hard numbers, when I was at Christie's about 3 years ago, we had around 500 people participating in our Geneva auction with, say, 250, 300 watches on offer. And this season, I believe over 1,200 people participated at Christie's, over 1,500 at Phillips, and that's a 300% increase in 3 years.
Is that the internet? Do you attribute that to the internet?
Internet, I think the sale of the Paul Newman, I do think there's definitely a symbiotic relationship between modern and the Rolex stainless shortage and the Patek Nautilus shortage and all these things, and people getting interested in vintage. I mean, watches as a class have a lot of real positive attributes. They're portable. They're not that expensive to maintain like a car. You can wear them around, easy to store a lot in a safe, all kinds of things. And it's a portable way to store wealth. And given returns, people are seeing even better than the market. So a lot of people are starting to put some assets into watches for sure that would be otherwise in financial instruments. So that's one other element in seeing the growth here. The other element is, even as it grows, the Instagram and social media and groups makes the community sort of smaller, which will in turn, I think, really affect auction houses, because dealers and collectors can find end users for it a way that a decade ago, before Instagram, you had no idea who the big collectors were. They weren't putting Key Talking Watches interviews with collectors, etc. So that, if I could short the major auction house watch departments, I would, because there's just not enough product and it's too transparent who the end users are. So for you to consign a watch at auction and give up 25% plus with the buyer's premium, plus have to wait 6 months, plus, by the way, these watches get manhandled, they get dropped in previews. A watch was stolen at a Philips preview. Someone took a Rolex Mill Sub and swapped it for a fake. So they just took it off the NATO.
Where's Carlo? He actually has been living off that for years.
So all these things make it sort of more interesting to sell things directly, which is obviously what my line of work is. So those are sort of macro trends I'm seeing. I'd welcome a few questions as well from people. Yes.
Can you comment on the Rolex, the Cartier Submariner that sold recently for, I think, $175,000?
Yeah, that was a really neat watch in that it had all sorts of documentation, from the original sales receipt from Cartier in Los Angeles to all the service receipts. And one of the great sort of paradoxes of this hobby is that the better someone took care of a watch over the years, the less valuable it is, because it meant you send it into Rolex and they keep replacing the parts and they keep polishing it. So that watch was one of the worst condition meters first Submariners I've ever seen.
Wasn't the estimate 40 or 50,000?
It was, yeah. And the gentleman is still alive. He wore a 3-piece suit to go to Cartier to buy that watch. I think he was 23 or 24 at the time. For another $50, he could have got the double reds sea dweller, but he couldn't afford it. But he was a diver, and he wore that watch frequently and got it serviced sort of every 3 years, like clockwork. And it still brought really big money, but the condition was so negative in some ways that really the serious collectors in my orbit, who are very condition oriented, were not interested. So it went to probably a newer collector, best we could tell, who was just interested in the story and the provenance and the paperwork. But it had a replaced bezel insert, replaced hands, and was really, really polished, unfortunately.
So I should continue to just beat up my Daytona.
Yeah, but don't polish it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just preface this. I don't know if this is a dumb question.
Yeah.
I am not the watch collector of the caliber in this room, so I'm just prefacing that. But so if we now know that not polishing and taking care of a watch actually creates more value, why does Rolex and so many other brands, why do we value taking care of it when the market tells you that there's no value in it?
Yeah, I
And
mean,
besides money, obviously,
yes,
service for the
yeah.
company. Besides that, is there any other intrinsic value that you don't know about?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really like unpolished watches, which is sort of a controversial word, unpolished, because it is somewhat a matter of opinion for some of these watches, just because if they're heavily worn, it's kind of in effect polishing just the wear and tear of the watch. But I sort of joke that my personal hell would be being locked in a Rolex service center polishing room with like tape over my mouth and my hands tied behind my back, just sitting there going zzz with all these watch cases, which they still do. And there's just a huge...
There's a Quentin Tarantino movie.
Yes. Yep, that's the next one. But I think that the watchmakers don't understand. They're trained to think about things to make them like new and their tools and objects and things. They don't have a collector mentality at all. So they're like, let's replace the dial and hands and make it so it glows brighter at night because that's more functional. Let's make it look shiny because that's what people want. And there's still a massive opportunity to educate them because they're not being trained properly.
So a couple weeks back, we had Watch Time magazine at South Coast Plaza panel. One of the panel guests said that he didn't feel that box and papers and some of that peripheral stuff made any difference at all. And I agree, boxes probably don't, but papers and that kind of documentation, in your opinion?
I think that it's a really nice cherry on top to have the original papers and box, but as I say, a crappy watch with box and papers is still a crappy watch. So that's one of the other sort of mistakes I see new collectors making. Oh, I only want to buy this if it has box and papers. Well, the watch could be heavily polished and have all kinds of replacement parts.
So then the follow-up to that is a great watch. Is it worth 10% more because it's got all of the documentation and paperwork?
The general rule is that having box and papers across from modern to vintage adds 25% in value.
So that's more significant than...
Yeah, but I believe in some cases, particularly with some of these very rare, plus you have that, you've got something that's extremely rare and that you never find. So I think these are definitely sort of trophy assets, and collectors are understanding every 6 months. I feel like the collector approach to each auction season, because basically we see 3 auction cycles within about a 3-week time period. There's Geneva, Hong Kong, and then to New York. Then the market breathes, and then it happens again. This is between May and June, and then November and December. But every season I see collectors getting smarter about condition and these sorts of things. And you're starting to get this huge change in value between average and exceptional condition, because there's a lot of group communication and sort of like, oh yeah, that really is a great watch.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do the collectors that are part of your world, do they wear these watches? I mean, are they passionate about it, or is it like the Seagraves watch where it goes from one vault to another vault?
In almost all cases, people wear these watches.
Good.
Even $1 million plus watches.
What about $17 million watches?
Maybe not that much. Yeah.
I'm a minor car collector, and I drive all my cars.
That's great.
I mean, I don't understand the mindset, but...
Yeah. No, I agree. I think most collectors I know try to avoid the safe clean, where it just sits in the safe.
Well, like the Seagraves.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So for people who have been mostly into modern watches and are very interested in vintage, you're obviously talking about high-end vintage, but want to learn. This may be too big a question, but are there a few small tips that you could give to how you start to learn about it? And really, because there's so much wealth of information on internet and Instagram and Hodinkee and this and that. It's overwhelming. Or as the ship sailed, and now if we haven't already learned about it and gotten into it, there's no hope that certain people can start to learn about it.
I mean,
and effectively buy a good watch.
I think there's more information now, which is great, and I expect it to continue to grow because I know so many people are passionate about educating. So, buying a Speedmaster a few years ago was not so easy to know what all these were. But then a couple things happened. There's a book called Moonwatch Only, which provides a really good sort of overview. And around that time, I did a reference points video on Hodinkee where we went through all the references as well. And there's more of that in the works. I just filmed one on the vintage Submariner with Hodinkee, which is coming out later this summer, which I'm excited about. But there's all kinds of sites that sort of, there's a site, I think it's called GMT Master 1675.
Eric, if you could be just a little bit louder.
Sure.
Than them back.
Yeah. So like if you want to learn about the Rolex GMT Master, the 1675, a friend sort of who's a doctor, he just did this on his own and created a website called gmtmaster1675.com. He goes through serial ranges, types of dials, etc. All these new sites. There's an Explorer site. There's Enicar, which is an interesting brand. There's a book coming out about them. You kind of have to pick what you're interested in and then learn, and a lot of the sort of fundamental rules you learn in collecting a Submariner apply to all other sport watches with luminous material and things on the dial.
So there's a lot more information available but you really need to get into that information because
Yeah.
other people have already gotten there.
Yes.
Does that
yeah.
make sense? Maybe you focus on one particular.
Yeah,
mind or-
and then you grow from there. I don't think we should hold up the entrees any longer.
No,
So if you
no.
have any more questions, let
Yeah.
me know after.
Anything else real quick?
Last
And-
question.
Why are you
And-
so fucking cool?
No, no. Thank you. Thank you.